The United States has plenty of enemies. That should come as no surprise given the country's position in the world. Even with the rise of China over the last 2 decades, the US is still seen by most as the world's most powerful country. And with that power comes influence. From its alliances with NATO and various countries in the Indo-Pacific region to setting up dozens of military bases around the world, the US takes great strides to ensure that its influence isn't just maintained, but actively felt by other countries. And that creates problems. Specifically, countries like China and Russia could be said to have anti-West agendas, and especially anti-America agendas, because they envy America having that top seat at the geopolitical table. That's an opinion shared by many in the US, at least according to a Gallup poll conducted in 2016, which asked Americans to name who they believed were their country's top enemies. North Korea topped the list 8 years ago with 16% of the vote, though Russia was a close second with 15%. Iran and China, receiving 14% and 11% respectively, were also identified as potential enemies, showing that the American people believe that if a threat were to come to the country's mainland, it would come from one of those countries. But there's bad news for America's enemies. No matter how much they hate the United States and would want to see it lose its influence over the rest of the world, the fact is that it's practically impossible for them to do anything about it. A military invasion would be incredibly difficult for many reasons, all of which we're going to cover in this video. So why will America's enemies hate this video? We'll start with the one thing that makes the world go round: money. The United States has a lot of it, and it spends more of its money on its military than any other nation in the world. In 2024, the United States approved a budget of $883.7 billion for national defense spending. The majority of this spending goes directly to the military, with $841.4 billion going to the Department of Defense. A further $32.4 billion is dedicated to the Department of Energy, which will use the money to fund national security programs designed to protect America's energy initiatives. As for the rest, it goes toward general defense-related activities, both inside and outside of the National Defense Authorization Act's jurisdiction. That's a lot of money. However, the sheer scale of America's military spending is best viewed through the lens of the countries that might consider starting a war with the US. In 2023, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation examined America's defense spending in the context of the top 10 military spenders on the planet. Not only did it find that the US topped the list at the time of the investigation, spending almost 3 times more than the second biggest spender in China, but it also found that the US spends more than the next 9 highest spenders combined. China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the UK, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and Ukraine combined spend $849 billion at the time of the Foundation's report. By contrast, the US spent $877 billion, $28 billion more on its own. That massive spending manifests in the world's strongest military. That's according to Global Firepower, which ranks the US first in its 2024 rankings of over 140 military nations. Using its Power Index metric, which considers a score of 0.0000 to denote a perfect military, Global Firepower determined that the US has a score of 0.0699. Financially, it has the highest budget, as already mentioned, and the second highest purchasing power parity. Its overall military is third in the world in terms of sheer manpower, though it makes up for that slight shortfall by having more people in its Air Force and Navy than any other country. Then there's the equipment. More aircraft than any other nation, with a stock of 13,309, makes the US dangerous against any foe in the air. And though its Navy is only the 4th largest in the world in terms of sheer numbers of boats, it makes its spending count in terms of water displacement and investment into the powerful vessels that win naval wars in the modern age. America has 11 aircraft carriers, 9 helicopter carriers, 75 destroyers, making it the world leader in those 3 categories. Add to that the second largest submarine fleet, which some would argue is actually the strongest fleet thanks to most of those submarines being nuclear-powered, and the US represents a formidable foe to even its strongest enemies in terms of pure military might. But the size and strength of America's military is far from the only problem that the US poses to a potential enemy invader. Its geography also offers major advantages. To the east and west of the United States lie 2 massive coasts. Add Alaska into the mix, and you have another massive coast that's a little separated from the American mainland. Combined, those coasts add up to 12,386 miles, with the west coast accounting for 1,293 miles, while the east and southern coasts, the latter linking into the former, combine for a total of around 3,700 miles. On the surface, that would make it seem that the US is primed for a coastal invasion. However, that's never happened for two reasons: the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. On either side of the US lie two massive oceans that separate it by thousands of miles from the majority of its enemies. Not only does the US patrol those oceans with its massive navy, ensuring it can intercept threats as they occur, which would give troops on the mainland more than enough time to prepare for a coastal invasion, but it also monitors those oceans. If a Chinese aircraft carrier starts sailing across the Pacific, the US is going to spot it long before it ever reaches a range close enough to send jets over the mainland. The same goes for an invasion from the east. Not only would the United States see it coming, but it would also have information coming from its European allies in NATO, more on them later, to help it get ahead of any attack from the Atlantic. All of this adds up to the US being practically impossible to invade via an amphibious assault. There's just too much distance involved. America would see it all coming long before it was under threat, thanks to the sheer power of its navy, would counterattack with devastating force to prevent an enemy like China or Russia from establishing any entry point via the coast. History backs up this assertion. The United States was a major player in World War I and World War II. Barring the attack on Pearl Harbor, which officially brought the United States into World War II, it faced no invasion on its own soil. While the rest of Europe was being blanketed by bombs dropped from Luftwaffe planes during World War II, the US was safe from attack because it wasn't possible for Nazi Germany to get those planes over to the American mainland. Likewise, when Germany was using U-boats to terrorize the oceans during World War I, America was still safe because those boats weren't capable of landing troops on its shores. Some historians even believe that the US allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, a theory called backdoor to war, as an excuse to allow it to enter the fighting in World War II. If that's true, then the only attack on American soil during that war was the one that US essentially approved itself. That debate is up in the air, and most historians don't believe the backdoor to war theory, but the difficulty of attacking the US via its coasts still exists today. Yes, planes can fly further and ships can sail in greater numbers, but the distance is still so large that it will be impossible to launch an assault without being spotted and countered. This spells trouble for those who stand against America. Still, perhaps it means a land-based invasion is possible. That's almost as unlikely as a naval invasion. After all, the US maintains very strong relationships with Canada, its neighbor to the north, and Mexico to the south. Even when those relationships are occasionally strained, they have never come close to the point where either would facilitate a full-scale invasion of the United States for one of its enemies. Doing so would not only make that nation an enemy itself, triggering retribution from a far more powerful military than Mexico or Canada could ever hope to muster, but it would violate the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Sometimes called the Neighbor Treaty, this agreement guarantees reciprocal trade and offers substantial economic benefits for all three nations involved. Benefits that Mexico and Canada wouldn't be willing to lose for the sake of supporting an invasion. But let's assume by some miracle that an American enemy manages to find a route to the mainland. Would it then have a clear shot at taking out America on home soil? Again, it seems unlikely. America has some of the world's most diverse geography wrapped up in its landmass. Thus, if the enemy came through Mexico, again hypothetically speaking, it would be forced to head for Texas or California. Both are exceptionally well defended. The US maintains nearly 50 military bases in those two states alone, 15 in Texas and 32 in California, that are home to thousands of troops alongside all of the equipment those troops need to act as a first line of defense against an invasion from the south. There would be no need to ship equipment to these regions to fight against the enemy threat. They'd be ready and waiting, taking advantage of their ability to funnel the enemy into strike zones, thanks to the southwestern desert regions, preventing incursion while avoiding California and Texas. Those bases would only need to hold the line as America sends more troops in support, creating a bottleneck in the south through which enemy forces are unlikely to get much further. Look elsewhere in the US and you see further geographical advantages. The mountainous regions to the west would offer a similar filtering effect to the deserts in the southwest. The Pacific mountain system stretches some 4,500 miles, running from Canada to Mexico, which causes severe problems for troops landing via the Pacific. Add to all of this America's sheer size, with vast plains and deserts lacking cover and leaving opposing forces vulnerable to America's massive firepower, and you have geography that seems tailor-made for protecting against an invasion. Okay, you might think, maybe the enemy won't try to invade directly. Instead, what if it manages to cut off the resources flowing into the United States, essentially starving its people out and ruining its war machine to the point of submission? That isn't likely to happen either. Let's look at food first. The United States is already very close to being 100% self-sufficient when it comes to food. Only 15% of its supplies come from overseas. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, also points out that about a third of the country's fresh vegetables, along with 55% of its fruit and 94% of its seafood, come from overseas. But it's that 15% figure that's the headline, because it means the US already produces 85% of its own food. Now combine that with the fact that the US exports around $170 billion of food annually. Should an enemy nation somehow create a blockade that prevents food from getting in or out, the US is already most of the way to being self-sufficient and would actually have more food due to its exports no longer shipping out. Furthermore, focusing on fixing the issue of land abandonment could be a massive boon for the United States. According to Yale University, the US lost 98,000 square miles of farmland to abandonment between 1997 and 2018. Reactivating just a small portion of that land would lead to even more food being produced, an action that would certainly be possible were the US forced to direct resources toward more food production. And this is all just to sustain levels and varieties of food that the US has right now. If push came to shove, America could focus on the basics alone, producing food in such high volumes that it would be impossible to literally starve its citizens out. What about military equipment? America is a long way ahead of the game there too. Though the United States military doesn't make its own equipment, it relies on scores of privately owned companies to build that equipment for it. Most of those companies are in the United States itself, meaning the US never finds itself in a position where it has to import vast quantities of equipment to keep its military running. Why would it? The country's private manufacturers already make the best equipment in the world, or close to, in the few cases where China or Russia might be superior, and this is evidenced by military equipment import figures. Trading Economics says that the US spent $214.36 million on military equipment imports in January 2024. Multiply that number by 12 to get an annual expenditure and you land on $2.572 billion, approximately 0.25% of the country's defense budget. That tiny expenditure tells you all you need to know about how reliant the United States is on other countries for its military technology. Simply put, it isn't. The American war machine can keep churning out equipment in-house via private contractors, with an enemy being unable to stop it via invasion for all the reasons we've already mentioned. So cutting the US off from its weapons isn't an option, but what about energy? Therein lies some potential for America's enemies. According to the US Energy Information Administration, or EIA, the US imports 8.51 million barrels of petroleum per day from other countries. It used about 20.01 million barrels per day back in 2022, which means we can estimate that it's importing around 40% of the petroleum it uses. But it doesn't need to. According to the EIA, the US actually exports more petroleum daily than it imports, at a rate of 10.15 million barrels. If an enemy tried to cut off America from its oil, it could simply stop exporting to amass the reserves it needs to keep its war machine churning. We see a similar situation with natural gas. During the first half of 2023, America's natural gas exports averaged 20.4 billion cubic feet per day. By contrast, 2022 saw it import 3.02 trillion cubic feet of gas. Divided by 365 to give us a daily figure, that amounts to about 8.27 billion cubic feet of gas bought from other countries. In that same year, the US consumed 32.21 trillion cubic feet of gas, meaning its imports account for less than a tenth of its total gas usage. The rest is sourced in the country itself, with the option of halting exports to make up a shortfall being available if its imported gas was cut off. It also has reserves. It had 625.4 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves by the end of 2021, with 44.4 billion barrels of oil during the same period. It even has a lot of coal ready to go if it needs to fall back on other energy resources, with 470 billion short tons of that resource available as of January 2022. That's not accounting for all the oil, gas, and coal that is yet to be drilled or mined out of the United States. Energy simply isn't going to be a problem because the US can be as self-sustaining as it is with food and military equipment. And with that, you have the three main resources needed to drive a war effort, none of which America's enemies can touch without invading the mainland, a feat that's already practically impossible. Add to all of this the fact that America has a strikingly small population compared to its sheer size. Its population is around 341 million people, spread across around 3.8 million square miles, whereas China, one of its potential enemies, has a population of 1.42 billion spread across 3.7 million square miles. If one of those countries is going to run out of resources, it's a safe bet that it'll be China long before the United States. So the US is more than capable of supplying itself in a time of war, with no reliance on outside countries. But what about getting those supplies to its military and people? It's at the top of the game in that area too. For instance, America's entire interstate system was designed on the back of a military operation. In 1919, Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to serve as an observer for the first transcontinental motor convoy. This convoy was essentially a road test for the military vehicles of the era, with the journey including 79 vehicles and stretching 3,200 miles between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. Through these observations, Eisenhower, who later became America's president, saw that the US needed an interconnected network of roads and bridges large enough to accommodate such vehicle processions. The unpaved roads, narrow passages, and rickety bridges of the era wouldn't do the job. His key observation was that higher-grade roads led to more success for the convoy. Around 35 years later, Eisenhower created the National Highway Program, assigning $50 billion to the program over 10 years. He aimed to build a vast network of interconnected highways. Now it would be a misnomer to claim that America's highways were built solely for military purposes. Eisenhower himself highlighted the 36,000 traffic fatalities, with those deaths having a massive effect on America's economy, as his chief reason for building the highways when passing the program through Congress. Still, the result was beneficial to America's military. It now had a massive network of large roads connecting every state in the Union. Those roads are invaluable for transporting goods, cargo, and military equipment. And it's not just roads that the US military can use to move equipment and troops around the country. The country's freight rail network spans 140,000 miles, connecting the states in much the same way as the highway system. If by some miracle an invading country manages to destroy a highway, this assumes the enemy even gets into the United States at all, the freight rail network offers a powerful alternative, as well as complementing the highway system. The US also has large rivers, which have historically proven important for transporting equipment during times of war. That's according to the US Naval Institute, which points out that World War II saw America regularly transporting steel and machinery for its war industry via the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, and Illinois rivers. Those rivers also proved invaluable when building naval vessels during the war. 3,943 ships were built inland using the river's waters between January 1942 and September 1945, with those ships then using America's river networks to make their way to sea. So again, an enemy would have to get far enough inland to attack and take these rivers, or else it would leave the United States free to use them to strengthen its navy. This trio of options the US has for transporting equipment and troops across state lines would also prove vital when any war on American soil inevitably ends up in an urban warfare situation. The US has no reason to engage its enemies in battles on wide-open plains. It can simply pepper them with aerial assaults, whittling down numbers and forcing the enemy to engage within built-up cities. Each of those cities could easily be fortified, with America's logistical network being used to transport tanks, artillery, and troops to force an invader to lose even more of its resources by getting bogged down in city-based battles. We've seen Ukraine use this tactic to great effect against Russia, with the latter having lost 442,880 of its troops because it has to constantly bombard fortified positions, and it's a tactic that would serve the US even better thanks to its logistical network and the sheer volume of military equipment it has. Then there are America's alliances. If we consider the United States as the closest thing the world has to an empire in the 21st century, we can consider how its approach to building that empire has been far different from the approaches seen in the past. Every empire of old built itself up in the same way, conquering territory to expand its influence. The United States has taken a different approach, instead building alliances with dozens of other countries while still positioning itself as the world's dominant military force. Why is that bad news for America's enemies? Those alliances would come to bear if the US was ever attacked on its own soil, and chief among those alliances is NATO, a collective of 32 countries, including the United States, that come together to handle global security issues. Each member of NATO agrees to Article 5 of the organization's charter, which states that if any NATO ally is subject to an armed attack, every other member of the organization will consider this as tantamount to an armed attack against themselves and will act accordingly. In other words, an attack on American soil wouldn't just be an attack on the United States. It would bring 31 other nations to the fight, each doing whatever it deemed necessary to support the US. That support could come in the way of troops and equipment being shuttled over to America to help defend it against an invading force. However, NATO could also make its strength known in other ways. For instance, let's assume that Russia is the attacking force. Given that most of NATO's members are in Europe, it's not outside the realms of possibility that they would attack Russia at home, making it more difficult for Vladimir Putin to keep his troops inside the United States supplied. Russia would be forced to fight a war on multiple fronts, a war that includes the world's strongest military nation. The US has other alliances too. We mentioned its close relationships with Canada and Mexico earlier, with those relationships being key to preventing a land-based invasion against the US. However, America also maintains strong relationships with several partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Its trilateral agreement with Japan and South Korea, in addition to a similar agreement it has with the UK and Australia, would serve as an early warning system. If a country tries to invade via the Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and Australia could all alert the US. The same goes for the Atlantic. The UK would see an attack from that direction coming. Add to all of this the fact that the US has around 750 military bases spread across 80 countries, and you have even more allegiances built up. Even the countries hosting those bases that might not participate directly on America's side in a war still have reason to support it, because losing the US means they lose military advantages that these bases provide. Now let's return to American soil. We've already established the reasons why the US is a nightmare to fight at home. The country's geography limits invasion points, giving America a chance to create choke points and funnel an invading army wherever it's most tactically advantageous to the United States. The country is self-sustaining, meaning it can't be cut off from supplies, and its vast logistical network means it can send troops and equipment anywhere they're needed. But there's something else the US has at home that could prove dangerous to its enemies. Its civilians. America's civilians are the most heavily armed in the world. According to Bloomberg, the country has 120.5 firearms for every 100 residents, making it the only country that has more guns than people. That could be a double-edged sword for the US. On one hand, a well-armed population is one that could fight alongside America's already powerful military. Urban warfare becomes a lot harder for an invading force when it might have to deal with civilians taking potshots, or even joining up with the military to fortify and defend cities alongside an army. But on the other hand, this proliferation of guns could also serve an enemy if it took a city, as it would have ready-made supplies it could give to ground troops so they could take the fighting elsewhere. Of course, the real question is, would America's civilians stay and fight at all? Interestingly, we have some statistics that suggest at least a large portion of them might. In October 2023, the Daily Mail reported on a study conducted by Quinnipiac University. The institution quizzed 1,374 American adults on what they would do should the country ever face an invasion by Russia that was similar to the one that we're seeing in Ukraine. Around 55% of the respondents said they would stay and fight to defend their country, while 38% said they would flee. If we assume that the 55% figure is accurate and we discount children from America's population, we can stack it against the 258.3 million adults the Census Bureau recorded in the United States in 2020. The result is a powerful force, 142,065,000 adults who claim they would fight to defend their country if an enemy ever invaded. Of course, how many of the 55% who say they'd stay and fight are telling the truth versus those who are all words and no action should the time come would only be discovered if the US was attacked. But an American enemy would be unwise to discount the civilian factor when trying to figure out how to topple its opponent. The desire to protect themselves and their land could prove just as dangerous as facing the full force of the American military. Combine all of these factors and you have the reasons why America's enemies will hate this video. It reveals that no matter how much they may want to topple the United States, they simply won't be able to defeat America on its own soil. But perhaps they won't have to, sowing seeds of discontent within the country, as Russia is believed to have done with the repeated interference via hacking and the dissemination of fake news during the 2016 election, may prove a far more powerful tool than attacking the US directly. Their solution may not be war. It may be to create such powerful divides within the US that the country ends up taking itself down. But what do you think? Do you see any weak point in the American defenses that the enemy could exploit to attempt an invasion? Which enemy, if any, do you think might try to go to war with the United States in the future? Tell us what you think below, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out if the US and China go to war, who loses, hour by hour. Or click this other video instead.